Hi everyone, welcome. I'm out here in my yard. I just got back from a week's vacation. I've only been back a few minutes, but since it's still light out, I was really interested in seeing how my outdoor worms are doing. It's supposed to be rainy tomorrow, and I won't have a chance to be able to check in on them tomorrow, so I thought that today, while it's still light out, I would make checking in on my outdoor bins the priority. Also because on my tracking spreadsheet, it's those systems that have not had any attention in the longest amount of time. There's not a lot to see over there. So I figured I would just head over there now with the camera, and we'll take a peek at how things are coming along over there. So yeah, and I've also got to check in on my garden. I'm very curious to see how things have progressed in the week since I've been gone. I can see all kinds of peppers and tomatoes, but I digress. Let's get over to the worms. So just as a quick recap, what I've got going on out here is the contents of what used to be my outdoor worm bag, and I separated all of the fine finished castings and put them in here. And then I had all the worms and all the rough large chunk material that got caught in the screen, which I had separated from this, and I did a separation of the worms and put the worms into sort of a new little environment here temporarily for a few weeks at least, to keep them in sort of an isolated quarantine location until I can confirm that it's basically just worms and no other weird creepy crawlies that I'd be bringing into my wormery. And then here, with all the finished castings, the assumption was that it's not just finished castings but also a lot of cocoons, so allowing this material here time so that the cocoons can all hatch. And then besides cocoons slipping through with the fine castings material, I also assumed a bunch of little baby worms probably fell through. So this is a cocoon and worm nursery, so to speak. And then the only other system I've got going on here was sort of an attempt to see if I could take the material from all of those red wiggler bins where I had all those worms die off. And since I started seeing worms in here, I thought I'd see if I could try to collect them up, because I started picking through this material and noticing that there are worms in here. And what I did was I set up a kind of a feeding area for them on the edge of the bin, a place where there's like nice moisture, a piece of plastic to force recirculation of the moisture, so that if there are worms coming out of cocoons in this material out here, then they've got a place to come to. And especially since this stuff has been sitting out here uncovered, it's been drying as well. So we're going to take a quick peek on how these three systems are doing, and then at least I'll feel like I'm up to speed with what's happening in my outdoor worm systems. Well, I could sense the light fading fast. It's becoming noticeably darker by the minute. So I'm going to try to make this happen pretty quickly here. A little mishap while I was away. Apparently the refrigerator door, at least the freezer door, was not entirely closed. So it looks like the entire contents of the freezer, for the most part at least, are toast. So I guess that basically means there's going to be a whole bunch of worm food available soon. Now here you'll notice this looks a little different, if you recall, from the way it looked from when we last left it. I did come in here because there was a lot of chit chat in the comments of my videos, people talking about using freshly cut grass from their lawn. So I figured, hey, I'll put some of that in here. The worms will probably appreciate it. And I didn't want to cover with plastic. I thought that that piece of cardboard that we were covering with when we started would be enough to keep the moisture in here. And it does seem like down here in the middle there is a pretty good amount of moisture. You can see I'm doing this barehanded. Usually I'll put gloves on before I go poking around in my bins, but I figured, what the heck, I'll just wash up after I'm done. So you might remember I did have a good number of worms in this system, and chances are that they're going to get a pretty generous feeding, because I got all kinds of stuff that was in the freezer that's pretty much all worm food at this point. So I figured as long as I've got this thing open, I might just run inside, because the majority of this stuff I just have in the sink right now and in a big pot, and I guess a lot of it is going to end up worm food. A lot of it will just end up in the compost barrel, where I've also got worms, and I got black soldier fly larvae. But of the worm bins that we're checking now, I believe that this is probably the most populous one, with the greatest number of adult worms in it. And I know that I had placed food in here last time I was in here, but the only thing I'm seeing in here is bedding, basically. Chunks of cardboard, chunks of paper, and stuff like that. So, you know, I believe it's been... Here's the cork. So I believe it's been about 12 or maybe 14 days since this bin was last checked in on. I can't remember which, but I know one of the 3 bins we're checking in on here was 14 days ago since we last checked in on it, and 12 days since the other 2 bins were checked in on. And down here in the middle where we last fed, there seems to be a good ample amount of moisture, which seems to be where all the worms are hanging out, which is a good thing. Things seem a little bit dry on the outskirts, but I'm glad to see that things didn't dry out too much. I was a little bit worried with only a piece of newspaper and a piece of cardboard covering the container, but it does seem like the covering was sufficient to keep adequate moisture in the bin to keep the worms pretty healthy and comfortable. And there definitely is a good number of worms in this system. And the only reason, like I said earlier, that they're quarantined is because I did notice that there were some black soldier fly larvae mixed in with these worms. And I figured before I bring any population of worms into my indoor basement wormery, I'd like to just confirm first that I've got no creatures living amongst that population of worms, such as black soldier fly larvae. Because, you know, I got nothing against black soldier flies or their larvae. I love having them in my outdoor compost container. I just, I don't really like the idea of potentially having black soldier flies or any sort of flies nesting and hatching and growing and who knows what in my basement. So, I'm sure there's not many of them either, but they do grow very rapidly, and once they do grow, they, you know, transform into a fly, and they'll try to crawl out of whatever container they're living in. So I figured within a couple weeks, those black soldier flies would grow to a point where they would pupate into a fly and just emerge from this container and exit on their own. And then it would be safe to take this population of worms down into my wormery and use them to start off a new red wiggler bin down in my wormery, which for the past few months has been devoid of any red wigglers because I lost all my red wigglers recently. So I'm really looking forward to having these little guys down in my basement so that I can once again have red wigglers amongst my my worm population in my wormery. So I'm gonna head inside really quick. Man, it's getting dark. I want to hustle and get this done. So I'm going to throw a little grass below, but I'm going to grab one of the packages of food that's spoiled from the freezer, not being shut, and everything in the freezer pretty much thawing out, and they're going to get a nice hearty feeding. So I will be right back. Okay, so here was a nice bag of green beans. They were all cut up and ready to be eaten, all prepared, and who knows how long they've been thawed. They're going to be worm food at this point. Seems like a bit much. I don't know if it's perhaps too much to put in here. And this stuff is basically all water. I mean, you can see it's soaking in water because it used to be a bunch of watermelon rinds. And it's amazing to see how much water came out of it. I'll probably just, I'm going to just ditch the water itself, and we'll just use what remains as far as the rinds are concerned. And I think that between all those green beans and these, you can see it's already starting to get a little moldy in there, and these watermelon rinds, they're going to be really in for a good treat. I'm thinking maybe I'll even put more of this dry stuff down low so that it can soak up some of this moisture from this thawing or already thawed food that they're getting. And there's a little bit left that'll rest on top, which is fine. I think it'll make much more sense to be right down here at the bottom underneath all this freshly added food. So normally I put stuff in straight out of the freezer, completely frozen, but this stuff has definitely had a chance to thaw and even kind of start to get a little bit nasty. So my loss is the worms gain. So I got a feeling that they're definitely going to enjoy this. It's just amazing to see how much moisture came out of these few pieces of watermelon rind, eh? Probably a good cup and a half worth of liquid or so, if my guess is correct. And even though it seems like kind of a lot, I think we're going to give them the majority of it. Maybe we'll hang on to a little bit, because maybe the other two systems that we're going to check in on could use a little bit of food. I don't really even remember where I stand with these other systems. It's weird, you know. I usually do a little refresher by reviewing the last video that I filmed of a bin before checking in on it, especially when there's been a good amount of time that has passed since I last checked in on it. But I really don't recall. I mean, I do remember the that bin that I'm trying to restore worms from, which was all that tainted material from my red wiggler bins from downstairs. I'm pretty sure I had put in some massive amount of food in there. It was a whole bunch of eggplant, I believe. So as far as that one needing food, I don't think that's the case. But I figured maybe if they're starting to if we're starting to see a few worms coming together in the nursery bin over in the feeding area. I think I had set up a feeding area. I may not have. Who knows? Maybe now is the time to start a feeding area in that bin, since I've got so much food now for worms, you know. I think it's going to be a bounty for the worms in the next couple days, because I got so much stuff that's just, you know, basically worm food at this point. And whatever doesn't get fed to the worms is going to end up just going into my compost barrel, I guess. Although I guess the other way to think of it is that I've got all this room in my freezer, so why not just keep it frozen until such a time that I could feed it to my worms. But I don't know, my worm population is a little bit reduced in numbers nowadays, so I really don't have that capability to do away with so much stuff as I used to. So I don't know, I'll have to decide. So we're running out of daylight here. Let's see if we can get the rest of these systems checked in on really quick, and then we'll know what's going on with all my outdoor systems. Alright, so like I said, this is the cocoon nursery. This is where all the nice fine castings that were in the outdoor worm bin ended up. And they're actually covered with a piece of plastic too. This is just a cardboard, sheet of cardboard covered in a plastic bag. So effectively it's a plastic bag covering the material. And I did see a couple little baby worms hanging out on the plastic. I usually want to get them off, you know. I never know how long the plastic is going to be set off to the side, and I don't want it to dry out and cause any harm to the poor little worms. So I know that besides baby worms and cocoons, I'm sure a good number of adult worms have also snuck through the screening process. So it's not a perfect screen. Definitely has some stragglers in it too. And here and there, right away, you could already see some worms right there on the surface, probably coming up to take advantage of the moisture that collects right beneath the sheet of plastic. They don't seem very lively though, right? They do seem a little bit lethargic. Now I'm just going to pick down into the material a little bit just to get a sense of what else might still be living in here. See that? Like right there, there's a couple of adult worms just hanging out down within the compost. So this is not just a nursery bin. I know it's kind of it's a nursery bin and a sort of a straggler bin. So there is a good number of adult worms in here that did sort of sneak through the screening process. And I don't even remember how long it's been now. It's been a few weeks since I emptied my outdoor worm system and screened out all these castings. So my intention was to give this material a good few weeks for whatever cocoons might be in it to start to hatch, and then we'll start to round them up. And you know, I mean, we got this bag of green beans over here. I'm wondering if it might be a good idea to sort of start rounding them up. I mean, I would have to create a little sort of a feeding area or a collection area for them off on one side of the bin. I didn't really come over here prepared with bedding and whatnot to do that with. I wonder if I should just maybe treat it as sort of a informal feeding. Maybe just throw some green beans down here in the middle and let them have at it. And then maybe the next time we check in here, we'll get a little preview as to how many worms there are active within the system. Because, you know, when they're living in a container full of more or less finished castings, I'm sure they're yearning for a nice fresh bite to eat. And it is kind of cool to see how many worms are in here. Almost everywhere I look, every time I push some material aside, I see, you know, worms hanging out all over the place. I just wonder if it's starting to get a little too dark for the camera. Hopefully it's capturing everything. So, a little unconventional. No bedding, no grit, none of that other fancy stuff like a normal feeding would consist of. I think I'm just going to take those green beans that I've got left over and I'm going to plop them in here. And then maybe that'll give us the incentive to pop back in here perhaps in a somewhat shorter period of time to see what sort of a turnout the green beans had. Because from what I remember, worms definitely like green beans. And I got a feeling if we put a whole bunch of them like this in there, man, I don't know what to expect. Am I making a mistake here? I don't know. I mean, when we look around within the material, we do see a good number of worms. And heck, if it takes them a couple weeks for this stuff, you know, for them to chew up this stuff and eat it and do away with it, that's fine. I don't think we're gonna have a problem. At least they'll be well fed. And maybe we'll get a little sneak preview as to how many worms we've actually got in this system already. Even before we start to see baby worms emerging from their cocoons. And I guess, you know, one take on it could have been that the worms probably could easily find a good amount of nourishment within this material, even if I didn't give them some straight up, you know, kitchen scrap type food to eat. But you know, by putting some real explicit, straightforward, yummy food for them to eat right down the middle, maybe we'll be able to get a better sense of how many worms we've got in the system the next time we check in here. So that's, yeah, I think that'll be kind of cool. Definitely see worms everywhere I look, almost every place I check. Worms squirming around, either kind of lethargic and just hanging out, not doing much, or somewhat active. But definitely got a good number of worms in this system, more than I thought, just from a brief look through the material. Okay, definitely running out of light quick, and I want to get to this last system really fast before I pack things up here. So let's move the camera over to that system. Okay, so when we went probing around in here earlier, I could definitely feel that the stuff on this side of the bin is getting very, very dry. I mean, it makes me wonder if there's any moisture in this whatsoever. And as I go right down to the very bottom, I would almost have to say that it's already probably too dry for worms to be able to live in it. So I would almost guess that this stuff on this side is probably, for the most part, worm-free at this point. It's gotta be. There's no way worms could be hanging out in that stuff at this point. And if you recall, all those systems that I had red wigglers in that gradually one by one started all kind of going at aerobic and having major die-offs, this was all the material that came out of those various systems. Almost all of the systems. The very first one of those systems that I had that experience in, I did actually empty the contents of that container out into the garden. But then the other 3 red wiggler bins that sort of had the same crash and burn situation occur, I placed all the material into here. So now, what have we here? That doesn't look like a worm. It's some sort of a larva. So yeah, that looks like a larva too. Whatever. So I guess it's to be expected, right? If you're gonna be running bins outside, you're probably gonna expect to have various types of other creatures coming into the system, trying to lay their eggs and raise their offspring within your worm bin. So I'm not interested in seeing how many insect larvae are living in here. I'm curious to see if any red wigglers have come together. And luckily the material on this side is nice and damp. So like I said earlier, I did at times go looking through this material before it dried out, and I was seeing scattered worms here and there, and it was for that reason I figured I would try to see if I could round them up, you know, and I would try to bait them. And it seemed like possibly sort of like a ditch effort, a final ditch effort to possibly revive even if it's a small population, to revive a portion of the population of the worms that used to live in my wormery, the red wiggler worms that used to live in my wormery. So after they all died, and I bought their castings out here in the garden, I had written the material off in a way, and I just left it all out here to sit. But when I did start probing through the material and noticing worms crawling through it, it made me wonder, hey, did we have some survivors, or are there cocoons that have baby worms emerging from them? And I guess so far we've spotted one worm. And like I said earlier, it's and you could probably see it now too, it is getting pretty dim out here and difficult to see. So I'm not sure how many more we're going to spot in here. It'd be kind of unusual if there was only one worm in here. I have to assume that there's got to be more. But since it's getting a little bit dark and hard to see, I wouldn't be surprised if I had a hard time locating them. It would be nice to see at least a few more, right? So here's another one. I don't mean to strand them out on the cardboard. We'll put them right back into the bedding once we're done. I'm also kind of glad to see that the moisture level in here is pretty good. By having the plastic covering over here, see here we got a couple more. So yeah, here we go. Now we're starting to bump into a few more of them. I'm sure there's little spots where we're going to find a few hanging out, probably zeroing in on some sort of a yummy morsel of food. They're not even very small worms. They're pretty good sized worms, come to think of it. I mean, the material, the castings that I had sort of written off and left out here. Here's another one. The stuff had sat out here for quite some time, just sitting out here in its bins, and during that time I'm sure a good number of cocoons hatched and baby worms kind of somehow muddled through and found food and had enough moisture to survive. And I would have to guess that these little guys are some of the worms that came out of the cocoons that were caught up in that material that I discarded. And I mean, so far we've seen 3 or 4. There's got to be more. But I'm not going to go crazy looking for them. I'm not going to go nuts looking for them. But you know, as long as we're in here, I am curious, because I think I mentioned earlier, I did put a pretty good sized chunk of food in here. I had placed a I mean, it's kind of weird that I'm not seeing anything that resembles it. Unless I'm getting this mixed up with another system. I'm going to have to review my video, but I thought I had put a half of an eggplant in here. And it's hard to imagine that three or four red wigglers could have possibly chewed up half of an eggplant. I'm wondering if I'm just getting this system confused with another system. I could be. Well, I did sort of expect to come in here and find half of an eggplant hardly touched and sort of on standby for, you know, feeding whatever number of worms do happen to be in this system here. But I don't see any signs of it. I can't remember if it was frozen. Maybe it was frozen, and maybe by thawing it might have just kind of turned to goo or something, and it's, you know, maybe it is all just still here and I'm just not seeing it or something. I don't know. Kind of unusual. I don't get it. I don't know what happened here exactly. Like I said, I could just be confusing things. That piece of eggplant could have been placed somewhere else and I'm just getting my lines crossed. Just got back from vacation, right? I got to get my brain re-engaged into my worm composting systems and sort of get caught up with where I left off with things. Like I said, I didn't try to do any sort of a refresher to remind myself of where things stand in any of these systems. I just wanted to come out here as quick as I could before things got really dark so I can size up how things are progressing in these systems and see what I could do in any of them that might have needed some attention. And I'm glad we had a chance to get rid of some of the spoiled foods that were in my freezer, and I guess there'll be a good many more feedings coming up in the near future, trying to do away with all of the spoiled foods that were in my freezer. So I think that's pretty much all there is to be done out here. So it's so dry over on this side of the bin. I'm wondering if I could just use some of this stuff to sort of level off things on this side, since everything on this other side is pretty much dried out completely. And then we could cover up in such a way that we've got a little bit better coverage of the side over here where we want to keep the moisture from escaping, so that the worms that are in there are nice and comfortable. Man, I sure hope we get a few more than what we saw in there. Probably counted no more than 10. So it'd be really nice if we had a greater worm recovery in this system than just 10 worms. But we'll see. Maybe it'll be the beginning of an interesting experiment. How to rebuild a worm population with 10 worms. Alright everyone, I got a little bit of cleaning up to do and putting stuff away, but I'm not going to bore you with that. But before I go, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. If you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Bye now.